The steam whistle screamed through the dry New Mexico air as the iron horse pulled into Fort Stanton station. And Grace Newton had never felt more alone in her 22 years of life than she did at that moment, clutching her worn carpet bag with trembling fingers while tears streamed down her dirt-smudged cheeks. She had left everything behind in Boston. Her mother's grave was barely 6 months old, her father's debts had consumed their small bakery, and the only answer to her desperate prayers had come in the form of a newspaper advertisement seeking a bride for a rancher named William Harper in Fort Stanton, New Mexico Territory. The correspondence had been brief, practical, devoid of warmth but promising security. Security was all Grace had hoped for anymore. Love seemed like a luxury for people whose lives had not fallen apart, but William Harper was not waiting on the platform. Grace stood there as the other passengers dispersed, her eyes scanning the weathered faces of cowboys, merchants, and a few Mexican families going about their business. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, so different from the gentle New England light she had known all her life. Her traveling dress, already wrinkled and stained from 3 days on various trains, clung to her back with perspiration. She waited and waited. The platform slowly emptied until only a few railroad workers remained, paying her no mind as they went about their duties. An hour passed. Then another. Grace's tears, which had started as quiet despair, became full sobs that shook her shoulders. She had spent every penny she had on the train ticket. She knew no one in this territory. William Harper's letters were tucked in her bag, but they contained no address beyond Fort Stanton itself, and his description had been vague at best. A tall man with dark hair, he had written. That described half the men she had seen. The station master, an elderly man with wire-rimmed spectacles, approached her as the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains. "Miss, are you all right? Do you have somewhere to go?" Grace could barely speak through her tears. She shook her head, humiliation burning through her grief. What kind of fool travels halfway across the country to marry a stranger? The kind of fool with no other choice, she answered herself bitterly. Now, the station master said awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with her display of emotion. "Perhaps I can help you find who you are looking for." "William Harper," Grace managed to say, her voice hoarse. "He was supposed to meet me here. We are to be married." The station master's expression shifted to something like pity mixed with discomfort. He cleared his throat. "Miss, I am afraid I have some difficult news. William Harper died 3 weeks ago. Fever took him sudden-like. Word must not have reached you back east before you departed." The world tilted beneath Grace's feet. She would have fallen if not for a strong hand that suddenly gripped her elbow, steadying her. "Easy there," a deep voice said. "I have got you." Grace looked up through her tears at the man who had caught her. He was tall, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and hair the color of wheat that curled slightly beneath his hat. His eyes were an unusual shade of green, like spring grass, and they held genuine concern as they looked at her. He had a strong jaw, clean-shaven unlike many of the bearded men she had seen, and his features had an honest, open quality that made something in her chest ease just slightly despite everything. "Thank you," she whispered, though fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The kindness in his eyes after so much hardship undid something in her, and she found herself sobbing harder than before, unable to control the grief and fear and exhaustion that overwhelmed her. The man did not let go of her arm. Instead, he pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it into her free hand. "Madam, whatever has happened, it cannot be so bad that we cannot find a solution. Please dry your tears." Grace took the handkerchief and pressed it to her face, trying desperately to compose herself. It smelled of soap and sunshine and leather, a clean masculine scent that was somehow comforting. She wiped her eyes, though the tears kept coming, beyond her control. "I am sorry," she said between gasping breaths. "I do not mean to make such a spectacle of myself." "The lady just received some mighty hard news, Gideon," the station master said. "She came all the way from back east to marry William Harper, and she just learned he passed." The man, Gideon, kept his steady gaze on Grace. His hand remained on her elbow, a grounding presence. "I knew William. He was a good man. I am sorry for your loss, though I suppose you did not know him well enough to grieve him personally." Grace shook her head. The tears were slowing now, though hiccuping sobs still caught in her throat. "I never met him at all. We only exchanged letters. But I spent everything I had to come here, and now I have nothing. No money, no family, nowhere to go. I am utterly ruined." The admission of her complete destitution should have shamed her, but she was beyond shame now. She was simply terrified. Gideon's expression grew thoughtful. He released her elbow but did not step away. "What is your name, madam?" "Grace Bartlett," she said quietly. "Well, it was Bartlett. I suppose it will remain so now." "Miss Bartlett, my name is Gideon Nash. I run a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. It is not much, but it is honest work and clean living. I lost my housekeeper 2 months ago when she moved back to Texas to be with her daughter. The house has suffered for it, I must admit. I can offer you room and board in exchange for help with the cooking and cleaning, if you would be willing. It would give you time to figure out your next steps at least." Grace stared at him. "You would offer employment to a complete stranger. How do you know I can cook or clean, can you?" "Yes, I grew up working in my father's bakery. I have kept house since my mother took ill 5 years ago." Gideon smiled, and it transformed his face from handsome to something warmer, more approachable. "Then we may have found a solution to both our problems. I can promise you I am a decent man, Miss Bartlett. Ask anyone in this town about Gideon Nash, and they will tell you I am honest and honorable. You would have your own room, your privacy respected. I am simply in need of help, and you are in need of a place to stay. What do you say?" The station master nodded encouragingly. "Gideon here is one of the most respected men in Fort Stanton, miss. His word is good as gold." Grace considered her options. She had none, really. She could accept this offer, or she could throw herself on the mercy of whatever charity might exist in this frontier town, if any. At least Gideon Nash looked her in the eye when he spoke. At least he had offered her his handkerchief and steadied her when she swayed. At least his proposition was honest work, not the other kinds of propositions a desperate woman alone might receive. "I accept," she said, her voice stronger now despite her red-rimmed eyes. "And I thank you for your kindness, Mr. Nash. Just Gideon, please. Let me get your trunk." "I have only this bag," Grace admitted, holding up her shabby carpet bag. Everything she owned in the world fit into one small bag. The thought would have made her cry again if she had any tears left. Something flickered across Gideon's face, an emotion Grace could not quite name. Sympathy, perhaps, but not pity. "Then we are ready to depart whenever you are." He led her to a wagon hitched outside the station. It was well maintained, the horse a sturdy bay mare who nickered softly as they approached. Gideon helped Grace onto the bench seat with a hand that was calloused but gentle, then climbed up beside her. As they pulled away from the station, Grace took her first real look at Fort Stanton. The town was small but bustling, built around the military fort that gave it its name. Adobe and wooden buildings lined the main street, including a general store, a saloon, a church, and various other establishments. Mountains rose in the distance, purple and blue in the fading light. Everything looked so foreign to Grace's eyes, so unlike the familiar streets of Boston. The air itself felt different here, thinner and drier, scented with sage and dust rather than sea salt and coal smoke. "It is not much like Boston, I imagine," Gideon said, as if reading her thoughts. "You know I am from Boston. Your accent gives you away. Also the cut of your dress, though if you will forgive my saying so, it has seen better days." Grace felt her cheeks flush. "Yes, well, my circumstances have been reduced recently. My father passed a year ago, leaving significant debts. The bakery was sold to satisfy his creditors. My mother had died 6 months before him. When I saw Mr. Harper's advertisement, it seemed like divine providence. Instead, it was just another cruel trick of fate." "I do not believe in cruel fate," Gideon said. "Things happen for reasons we cannot always see. Perhaps you were meant to come to New Mexico territory, just not for the reason you thought. That is a charitable way to view my disaster. I prefer to think the disaster is that my ranch has been falling into disarray without proper keeping. You are the solution, Miss Bartlett, not the disaster." Despite everything, Grace felt a small smile tug at her lips. It was the first time she had smiled in months. "You are kind to say so." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The landscape opened up around them as they left the town behind, vast and empty in a way that both frightened and awed Grace. She had never seen so much open space. In Boston, buildings crowded against buildings, people pressed against people. Here, the land stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scrub brush, the occasional tree and distant rock formations that glowed red in the setting sun. "Is it always so beautiful?" Grace asked softly. Gideon looked out at the landscape, then at her. "I suppose I have grown accustomed to it, but yes. Yes, it is. Wait until you see the stars tonight. No city lights out here to dim them. Looks like God spilled diamonds across black velvet." "You are a poet, Mr. Nash." "Gideon," he corrected with a grin. "And I am no poet. Just a rancher who appreciates what he has." As the sun sank lower, they turned onto a smaller track that led toward a cluster of buildings nestled against a hillside. As they drew closer, Grace could make out a house, a barn, a few outbuildings, and fenced corrals. The house was larger than she had expected, built of adobe with a wooden porch that wrapped around two sides. It looked sturdy and well built if a bit neglected. The porch needed sweeping and one of the shutters hung crooked. "Welcome to the Nash Ranch," Gideon said. "It is not grand, but it is home." He helped her down from the wagon, and Grace stood looking at the house that would be her new home, at least temporarily. A dog emerged from behind the barn, a large brown and white creature who bounded over to greet them. Gideon scratched the dog behind the ears affectionately. "This is Sage. She is friendly, I promise." Sage sniffed Grace's skirts thoroughly, then seemed to decide she was acceptable and wagged her tail. Grace reached down hesitantly to pat the dog's head, and Sage leaned into her touch. "She likes you," Gideon observed. "That is a good sign. Sage is an excellent judge of character." He led Grace inside. The main room was spacious, with a large fireplace dominating one wall. Comfortable but worn furniture was arranged around it. A dining table stood to one side, and doorways led to what Grace assumed were bedrooms and the kitchen. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, and dishes were piled in the kitchen basin, but the house had good bones. She could see its potential. "I know it is a mess," Gideon said apologetically. "I have been batching it for too long. Your room is through here." He showed her to a bedroom that was simply but nicely furnished with a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a chair by the window. The bed had clean linens at least, and the room smelled of cedar. "I changed the sheets this morning when the station master mentioned a lady would be arriving on the train," Gideon explained. "I did not know the circumstances, but I thought perhaps William might need help, or Well, I did not know what I thought. I am glad I prepared the room regardless. You knew I was coming. The station master mentioned it last week when I was in town for supplies. News travels in a small community like this. I knew William had written for a bride. I am sorry he did not live to meet you. He was a good neighbor. Grace set her carpet bag on the chair. Exhaustion was catching up with her now, along with hunger. She had not eaten since that morning, and then only a bit of bread she had saved from the day before. As if reading her mind again, Gideon said, "I will warm up some stew. It is 3 days old and probably terrible, but it is food. Tomorrow we can start fresh, literally, with a decent breakfast if you are up to cooking." "I would like that," Grace said. "I would like to feel useful again." They ate the mediocre stew together at the table by lamplight. Gideon had been right about the stars. Through the window, Grace could see more stars than she had ever imagined existed, scattered across the sky in brilliant profusion. Gideon told her about the ranch as they ate. He raised cattle primarily, along with a few horses. He employed 2 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, men named Carlos and Jim, who she would meet tomorrow. The work was hard but satisfying. He had bought the ranch 5 years ago with money saved from years of cowboying across Texas and New Mexico territory. "Why did you never marry?" Grace asked, then immediately regretted the forward question. "Forgive me, that was too personal," but Gideon did not seem offended. "I came close once, about 3 years back. A woman named Sarah. We courted for 6 months, but in the end she could not see herself in this life. She wanted city amenities, culture, society. She went back to St. Louis and married a banker. I realized then that I needed someone who could love this land like I do, or at least learn to love it. I have not met that woman yet." He said it matter-of-factly, without bitterness, but Grace sensed the old hurt beneath the words. She understood. She had her own disappointments, her own losses. "I never courted anyone seriously," Grace admitted. "There was a young man once who worked at the printer's shop near our bakery. Thomas. But my mother grew ill and my father needed me in the bakery, and Thomas eventually married someone else. After that, there was no time. Caring for mother, then losing her, then father's decline and death. When the creditors came, I realized I was 22 years old with no prospects and no future. Mr. Harper's advertisement seemed like an answer to prayer, but perhaps God had a different plan all along." "Perhaps he did," Gideon said gently. After dinner, Grace could barely keep her eyes open. Gideon showed her where the washing facilities were, then bid her good night. Grace changed into her nightgown, washed her face, and fell into bed. She expected to lie awake worrying about everything that had happened, but instead she fell immediately into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee. For a moment she did not remember where she was, and panic seized her. Then it all came back. The train. The news about William Harper. Gideon Nash and his kind green eyes, offering her salvation in the form of honest work. Grace rose and dressed quickly in her other dress, which was hardly better than the one she had traveled in. She would need to make herself new clothes soon if she could afford fabric. She pinned up her dark brown hair, washed her face, and ventured out into the main room. Gideon stood at the stove, attempting to fry eggs. From the look of the pan, he was not succeeding very well. He glanced up when he heard her and smiled ruefully. "Good morning. I was trying to have breakfast ready, but I am afraid I am proving why I needed a housekeeper." "Let me," Grace said, moving to take over. "Please." She salvaged what she could of the eggs and started fresh with the rest. In the pantry she found flour, lard, baking powder, and salt. While the eggs finished cooking properly, she whipped up a batch of biscuits and got them in the oven. Gideon watched her work with open admiration. "You make it look easy." Years of practice. My mother taught me to bake before I could read. Is there any butter? In the cold box outside. The butter was rancid. Grace made a note to add that to the list of things needed. But the eggs turned out well and the biscuits were golden and fluffy. They ate together as the sun climbed higher, and Grace felt something settle inside her. This was familiar. This was what she knew how to do. After breakfast, she surveyed the house with a critical eye. It would take days to get everything properly clean, but she could make a start. Gideon offered to help, but she shooed him off to his ranch work. This was her domain now. Grace spent the day cleaning. She swept and scrubbed, dusted and organized. She found mouse droppings in the pantry and set traps. She washed dishes and linens, boiled water and hauled it from the pump outside until her arms ached. It was hard work, but it was satisfying in a way nothing had been for a long time. She was making something better. She was creating order from chaos. Gideon came in at midday with 2 ranch hands in tow. Carlos was a Mexican man in his 40s with a weathered face and kind eyes. Jim was younger, perhaps 30, with red hair and a shy smile. Both men removed their hats and greeted her respectfully. Grace served them the lunch she had prepared from the supplies she found: beans, salt pork, and fresh bread she had managed to bake in the old oven. "Madam, this is the finest meal we have had in months," Carlos said sincerely. "You are a blessing to this ranch." "Carlos speaks the truth," Jim added. "Gideon's cooking has been punishment." Gideon laughed and did not argue the point. After the men returned to work, Grace continued her cleaning campaign. By evening, the main room and kitchen looked transformed. Everything was clean, organized, and welcoming. Grace had even found some wildflowers growing near the pump and put them in a jar on the table. When Gideon came in for supper and saw the changes, he stopped in the doorway and just stared. "Miss Bartlett, I do not know what to say. The place looks better than it has in years." "I am not finished yet," Grace said. "Tomorrow I will tackle the bedrooms and mending. I noticed some of the curtains are torn." They fell into a routine over the following days. Grace rose early to make breakfast, then spent her days managing the household while Gideon and the ranch hands worked the land and cattle. She cooked, cleaned, mended, and organized. She found it deeply satisfying. Each task completed was a small victory, proof of her value and competence. Gideon was an ideal employer. He was respectful of her privacy, grateful for her work, and easy to talk to. In the evenings, after supper, they often sat on the porch and talked. He told her about the ranch, about his dreams of building the herd and perhaps one day buying the adjoining property. She told him about Boston, about her parents, about the bakery and the regular customers who had been like family. "You miss it?" he asked one evening about 2 weeks after her arrival. Grace considered the question honestly. "I miss my parents terribly. I miss the bakery as it was when I was a child, when it was thriving and happy. But Boston itself? No, there is nothing for me there now. Everything I loved is gone. Here at least I have purpose. I have work that matters." "It matters a great deal," Gideon said quietly. "You have made this house a home again. I did not realize how much I was simply existing rather than living until you arrived and reminded me what a real home feels like." Something in his tone made Grace's heart beat faster. She glanced at him in the lamplight and found him already looking at her. His expression was warm, open, perhaps a bit vulnerable. "I am glad I could help," she said softly. "Grace," he said, using her first name for the first time. "May I call you Grace?" "Yes, I would like that." "Grace, I want you to know that you are welcome here for as long as you wish to stay. Not just as an employee. As part of this ranch, this can be your home if you want it to be." "I do want that," Grace admitted. "I have been happier these past 2 weeks than I have been in years. I wake up with purpose. I go to bed satisfied with the day's work, and I enjoy our conversations. You have become a friend, Gideon. I have enjoyed our conversations as well, more than I can say. They left it at that, but something had shifted between them. Grace felt it in the way her heart lifted when she heard Gideon's footsteps on the porch. She noticed the way his eyes sought her out when he came in from the range. Small touches became more frequent, his hand on her shoulder as he passed, her fingers brushing his when she handed him his coffee. A month after Grace's arrival, the ranch faced its first crisis. Gideon and the hands had been moving part of the herd to fresh grazing when they discovered that someone had cut the fence and made off with a dozen head of cattle. "Rustlers," Gideon said grimly at supper. "We found tracks heading north. It is a significant loss. Will you go after them?" Grace asked, fear clutching at her chest. "Not much point. They have too much of a head start, and tracking them into the mountains would be dangerous. We will repair the fence and increase our patrols. I have also sent word to the sheriff in Fort Stanton." But the rustlers struck again 3 nights later, taking another 8 head. This time, Gideon was determined to act. He, Carlos, and Jim prepared to track the thieves at first light. Grace helped him pack supplies, her hands trembling slightly. "Please be careful. Cattle can be replaced." "You cannot." Gideon looked at her, and something profound passed between them. "I will come back, Grace. I promise you that. You cannot promise such a thing." "Then I promise I will do everything in my power to come back. Is that better?" Marginally. She tried to smile but failed. "I will worry every moment until you return." He reached out and took her hand, the first time he had done so deliberately. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. "Having someone worry about me is a gift I have not had in a long time. Thank you for that." They stood there, hands clasped, until Carlos called that they were ready to ride. The 3 days Gideon was gone were the longest of Grace's life. She threw herself into work, baking enough bread for a month, scrubbing floors that did not need scrubbing, mending clothes that had only the smallest tears. Anything to keep busy, to keep from imagining all the terrible things that could happen. On the evening of the 3rd day, she was preparing supper when she heard horses approaching. Grace ran to the window and saw 3 riders coming up the path. Her heart soared when she recognized Gideon in the lead. She was out the door and running before she realized what she was doing. Gideon dismounted quickly and caught her as she reached him. Without thinking, Grace threw her arms around him. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair. "I was so worried," she said against his chest. "I am here. I am safe. We all are." She pulled back enough to look up at him. "Did you find them?" "We did. They had a camp in the foothills. Sheriff and his deputies met us there. We recovered most of the cattle, and the rustlers are on their way to Santa Fe for trial. It is over." Relief flooded through Grace. Only then did she realize she was still in Gideon's arms, in full view of Carlos and Jim, who were very pointedly not looking at them. She stepped back, blushing. "I am sorry. I did not mean to be so forward." "I did not mind," Gideon said, his green eyes warm. "I did not mind at all." That night, after the others had gone to bed, Grace and Gideon sat on the porch as had become their custom. The stars blazed overhead in their usual glory. "Grace, I need to tell you something," Gideon said. "While I was tracking those rustlers, all I could think about was getting back here. Getting back to you. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being about having a housekeeper. You have become far more important to me than that." Grace's pulse quickened. "You have become important to me as well. I know you came here to marry William Harper. I know you have been through tremendous loss and upheaval. The last thing I want is to take advantage of your vulnerable position in any way, but I would be dishonest if I did not tell you that my feelings for you have grown far beyond friendship or gratitude." "What are you saying, Gideon?" He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you. Somewhere between your first batch of biscuits and your smile when you see the sunset, between your kindness to the ranch hands and the way you hum when you bake. I love you, Grace. And if you could ever see your way to feeling the same, I would count myself the most fortunate man in New Mexico territory." Tears filled Grace's eyes, but these were not the tears of sorrow she had shed on the train platform. These were tears of joy. "I do feel the same. I love you too, Gideon. I think I started falling for you the moment you handed me your handkerchief and told me we would find a solution. You have shown me nothing but kindness and respect. You have given me a home when I had nothing. But more than that, you have given me hope again. You have made me laugh. You have reminded me that life can be good even after loss." Gideon stood, gently pulling her to her feet. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Grace whispered. He cupped her face tenderly and kissed her. It was soft and sweet and full of promise. When they parted, both were smiling. "Marry me," Gideon said. "Not because you need security or a home, though you will always have those with me. Marry me because I love you and you love me, and because we can build a beautiful life together." "Yes," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Fort Stanton. Carlos and Jim stood as witnesses, along with several townspeople who had come to know and like Grace during her trips to town for supplies. She wore a new dress she had sewn from fabric Gideon had bought her, simple but pretty in a shade of blue that matched the New Mexico sky. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon kissed her soundly, to the cheers and applause of those gathered. Grace felt happiness swell in her chest until she thought she might burst with it. This was nothing like the practical arrangement she had been traveling toward when she first boarded that train. This was real love, freely given and joyfully received. The ranch became fully theirs, not just Gideon's with Grace's help, but a shared enterprise. Grace's skills with baking led to a new source of income when she began selling her bread and pastries to the general store in Fort Stanton. The extra money allowed them to buy the adjoining property Gideon had dreamed about, expanding the ranch significantly. Carlos and Jim became like family. They were fiercely protective of Grace and clearly delighted that their boss had found happiness. The house remained immaculate under Grace's care, always welcoming and warm. In the spring, nearly a year after Grace had arrived, she discovered she was with child. Gideon's joy was boundless. He became even more attentive, insisting she not work too hard, though Grace felt perfectly fine and had no intention of becoming an invalid. "I grew up working in a bakery," she reminded him. "I am hardly delicate, but you are precious to me," he countered. "Humor me." Their son was born in December, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. They named him Matthew, after Grace's father. He had Gideon's green eyes and Grace's dark hair, and both his parents were utterly besotted with him. Grace had never imagined she could be this happy. The grief of losing her parents would always be with her, but it had softened into a sweet ache rather than a sharp pain. She had found love in the most unexpected place, with the most wonderful man. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts. Matthew grew healthy and strong, adored by everyone who met him. When Matthew was 2, Grace gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Sarah. The house became even more full of life and laughter. Gideon proved to be a wonderful father, patient and loving, teaching Matthew to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, and cradling the twins with gentle hands that seemed too large for such delicate creatures. One evening, when the children were finally asleep and Grace and Gideon sat on their porch in the quiet darkness, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her here. "You ever think about that day at the train station?" she asked Gideon. "Often," he admitted. I had been in town picking up supplies. I had planned to head straight back to the ranch, but something made me delay. I wanted a cup of coffee, I told myself, though I had coffee at home. I think perhaps God knew you needed help, and He put me in the right place at the right time. I was so lost that day, so frightened and alone. You are never alone now. You have me, the children, this whole life we have built together. I know. And I am grateful every single day. When I stepped off that train sobbing, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning. Gideon reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in the familiar gesture that still made her heart flutter. "You know, I am glad William Harper placed that advertisement, though I am sorry he died. Without it, you never would have come to New Mexico, and I never would have found you. Strange how things work out. Not strange, perfect. You are perfect for me, Grace Nash. You always have been." She leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out at the land that had become her home. The stars were brilliant as always, that spill of diamonds across black velvet that Gideon had promised her on her first night here. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The night air smelled of sage and juniper and the particular dusty sweetness of the desert. This land had seemed so foreign when she first arrived, so intimidating in its vastness. Now she could not imagine living anywhere else. She had learned to love it as Gideon did, to see the beauty in the stark landscapes and wide skies. She had learned to appreciate the slower pace of life, the way people helped their neighbors, the satisfaction of hard work and simple pleasures. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Matthew became a skilled rider and roper, following his father around the ranch with complete devotion. The twins were as different as night and day, Emma bold and adventurous, Sarah thoughtful and gentle. Grace taught all the children to read and write, determined they would have the education she had valued from her own childhood. When Matthew was 8, they added another room to the house to accommodate their growing family. Grace was pregnant again, and though they did not know if it would be a boy or girl, Gideon wanted to be prepared. "I want a house full of love and laughter," he told her. "As many children as God sees fit to bless us with." Their fourth child was another boy, whom they named James after Gideon's father. He was a calm baby, easy and sweet-tempered, and he completed their family in a way that felt absolutely right. The ranch continued to prosper. Grace's baking business expanded, and she eventually hired a young woman from town to help with the increased demand. Gideon's herd grew, and he earned a reputation for raising quality cattle. Carlos and Jim both married, bringing their wives to live on the ranch and adding their own children to the community that had formed around the Nash family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Gideon surprised Grace with a beautiful wooden sign he had carved himself. It read, "Nash Ranch EST. 1875, with a smaller inscription below, "Built on love, faith, and second chances." He mounted it over the entrance to their property, and Grace cried happy tears when she saw it. "Second chances," she repeated, touching the words. "That is exactly what this is." "For both of us," Gideon said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I was just existing before you came. You taught me how to truly live. And you saved me when I had lost everything. You gave me a reason to hope again." They stood together, looking at the sign, their children playing nearby. Grace thought about the terrified woman who had stepped off that train a decade ago, sobbing and hopeless. She barely recognized that version of herself. The woman she had become was strong, confident, deeply loved and loving in return. "No regrets?" Gideon asked softly. "Not a single one." "Well, perhaps one small regret." "What is that?" That I did not meet you sooner so we could have had even more years together." He laughed and kissed her temple. "Then we will simply have to make the most of all the years ahead." And they did. As their children grew and eventually started families of their own, Grace and Gideon remained the heart of the ranch, the center around which everything else revolved. They were partners in every sense of the word, working side by side, facing challenges together, celebrating triumphs as one. Matthew married a sweet girl named Rebecca who had grown up in Fort Stanton, and they built a house on the Nash property, keeping the family close. Emma surprised everyone by becoming the most skilled horsewoman in the county, eventually breeding and training horses alongside her father. Sarah married a schoolteacher and moved to Santa Fe, though she visited often. James, always the quiet one, discovered a talent for working leather and opened a saddle-making business that supplemented the ranch income nicely. As grandchildren arrived, Grace's heart expanded to hold even more love. She taught her grandchildren to bake, just as her mother had taught her. She told them stories of their grandfather's kindness, how he had dried her tears on a train platform and changed her life forever. The years softened both Grace and Gideon. His hair turned silver, her face gained lines around the eyes from years of smiling, but their love never dimmed. If anything, it deepened with time, growing richer and more complex like good wine. On their 30th anniversary, their children threw them a party. The entire community came to celebrate. As Grace looked around at the gathering, she was overwhelmed with gratitude. All of this, every bit of it, had sprung from that terrible, wonderful day when she had arrived in Fort Stanton with nothing but tears and a carpet bag. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked, finding her in a quiet moment. "I am thinking about divine providence. How what seemed like the worst day of my life was actually the best thing that could have happened. If William Harper had lived, I would have married him out of desperation. It would have been a practical arrangement at best. Instead, his death freed me to find real love, to find you." I think about that too. How many small decisions led to that moment? If I had not stopped for coffee that day, if you had taken a different train, if the station master had not been kind enough to tell you about William, so many tiny pivots that brought us together. It makes you believe in fate. "Or faith," Gideon said. "Faith that things work out the way they are meant to." Later that night, after the guests had gone and the children had returned to their own homes, Grace and Gideon walked out to the porch. It was their place, always had been. The place where they had first admitted their love, where they had made countless decisions about the ranch and the family, where they had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. The stars were as brilliant as ever. Grace had never grown tired of them. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" she asked. "About the stars looking like God spilled diamonds across black velvet." "I do. You were right. And you know what? Every time I look at them, I am grateful. Grateful for this life, this love, this family. Grateful for the man who saw a sobbing woman on a train platform and decided to help rather than walk away." "Best decision I ever made," Gideon said simply. They stood together in the darkness, hand in hand, as they had done countless times before and would do countless times again. The house behind them was full of memories and love. The land around them was the fruit of their labor and dreams. And the stars above were the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the births of their children, every significant moment of their shared life. Grace thought about the girl she had been, the one who had believed love was a luxury she could not afford. How wrong she had been. Love was not a luxury. It was the very foundation of everything that mattered. It was what transformed a house into a home, what turned hard work into joyful purpose, what made the ordinary extraordinary. "I love you," she said to Gideon, the same words she said every day but which never grew stale or meaningless. "I love you too," he replied, as he always did. Today, tomorrow, and all the days after that. They went inside together, to the home they had built, to the life they had created from tears and kindness and the courage to hope again. And as they closed the door behind them, the stars continued their eternal watch over the Nash ranch, bearing witness to a love that had transformed two lonely people into a family, a legacy, a testament to the power of second chances. The end of their story was not really an end at all, but rather a continuation. Their love lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the land they had tended so carefully, in the community they had helped build. The ranch would pass to future generations, each adding their own chapter to the story that had begun with a sobbing woman and a compassionate cowboy. But if you had asked Grace in those final golden years of her life if she had any regrets, any wishes to change anything, she would have smiled that same smile that had captured Gideon's heart decades before and told you no. Everything had unfolded exactly as it should have. The grief and loss she had endured had led her to the greatest joy she had ever known, and if you had asked Gideon, he would have agreed. Finding Grace had been the defining moment of his life, the pivot around which everything else turned. He had been complete before he met her, but with her, he was whole. As they aged gracefully into their 70s and then 80s, they remained inseparable. They still took their evening walks around the property when weather permitted. They still sat on the porch watching sunsets. They still held hands like young lovers, their fingers knowing each other's contours as well as they knew the lines of the land they called home. When Gideon's health began to fail in his 84th year, Grace nursed him with the same tenderness he had shown her throughout their marriage. Their children tried to convince her to let them help more, but she refused. "He took care of me when I had nothing," she told them. "Let me take care of him now." She read to him, kept him comfortable, made sure he was never in pain or alone. And on a spring evening with the windows open to catch the desert breeze, Gideon passed peacefully with Grace, holding his hand. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of New Mexico territory. Gideon Nash had been a respected rancher, a valued member of the community, a beloved father and grandfather. But most of all, he had been a good man, the kind of man people aspired to be. Grace grieved deeply, as she had known she would. Losing Gideon was like losing part of herself. But even in her grief, she was grateful. Grateful for every year, every day, every moment they had shared. Not everyone got to experience a love like theirs. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by family, still baking for the grandchildren, still telling stories of the old days. She never remarried, never even considered it. She had had her great love, and it would last her for whatever time remained. On a quiet morning in late summer, Grace passed away in her sleep. Her family found her peaceful and still, a slight smile on her face. On her nightstand was a photograph of her and Gideon on their wedding day, young and full of hope. They buried her next to Gideon on a hill overlooking the ranch. The entire family gathered, along with friends from across the territory. As they said their final goodbyes, someone mentioned that they had never seen two people more perfectly matched than Grace and Gideon. Matthew, now an old man himself with grandchildren of his own, smiled through his tears. "My father used to say that finding my mother was like finding the missing piece of himself he did not know was missing. And my mother always said that the worst day of her life led to the best thing that ever happened to her." "Tell us the story again, Papa," one of his grandchildren asked. About how grandmother came to New Mexico. And so Matthew told the story, as it would be told for generations to come. The story of a young woman who stepped off a train sobbing, her dreams shattered and her future uncertain. The story of a cowboy who saw her tears and offered kindness. The story of how that simple act of compassion blossomed into a love that sustained them through decades, trials, and triumphs. He told them how Gideon had dried Grace's tears that day and never made more. How from that moment forward, he had dedicated himself to bringing her joy instead of sorrow. And how Grace had transformed his house into a home, his solitary existence into a full and abundant life. The children listened with wide eyes, as children always do when hearing tales of true love. And when Matthew finished the story, they asked the question children always ask. And they lived happily ever after. Yes, Matthew said, looking out over the land his parents had built together. Yes, they did, as happily as any two people could ever hope to live. And that was the truth. Grace and Gideon Nash had lived there happily ever after, not because their life had been perfect or easy, but because they had faced it together, with love as their foundation and faith as their guide. They had built something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love and family and community that continued to ripple outward, touching lives they would never meet. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations, always carrying the name Nash. And on certain quiet evenings, when the stars blazed particularly bright, the family members who gathered on that familiar porch swore they could feel the presence of Grace and Gideon, still watching over the land they had loved, still together in whatever came after. It was a good ending. The kind of ending that felt earned and true. The kind of ending that reminded everyone who heard the story that even in our darkest moments, hope remains. That kindness matters. That love, real love, can transform everything. Grace had stepped off that train broken and hopeless, and she had died decades later surrounded by love, having lived a life richer and fuller than she had ever imagined possible. All because a cowboy with kind green eyes had seen her tears and decided to help rather than walk away. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the largest ripples. Sometimes, the worst moments lead to the best outcomes. Sometimes, when we are at our lowest point, grace appears in unexpected forms. For Grace Bartlett, who became Grace Nash, Grace had appeared in the form of a rancher named Gideon on a train platform in Fort Stanton, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1875. And from that moment of meeting, everything had changed. Their love story was not complicated or dramatic. It was simple and true, built on respect, friendship, and genuine affection. But simple does not mean insignificant. Their love had been the kind that builds families, sustains communities, and leaves the world better than it found it. And if Grace could have spoken from beyond the grave, she would have told every broken-hearted person the same thing she had learned that day on the train platform. Sometimes, when one door closes, another opens. Sometimes, what seems like an ending is actually a beginning. Sometimes, the very moment we think we are lost is the moment before we are found. She would have told them to keep faith, to accept kindness when it is offered, to be brave enough to hope again even after disappointment. She would have told them that love is worth the risk, always, and that the right person can make all the difference. But most of all, she would have told them her simple truth, that a cowboy once dried her tears, and from that act of compassion grew a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond, proving that even in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, tenderness and devotion could not only survive but thrive, creating something beautiful that would endure long after the tears had dried and the years had passed into memory and legend.